students, it's Dr. Marks, and we're overviewing Thailand for our fourth part where we're going to talk about standard of living, poverty, and inequality. Standard of living in Thailand is very different from the United States. You've probably already gotten a good sense of that, but it will be incredibly obvious when we're there. So we need to know what measures economists use to make comparisons like this. If I wanted to compare standard of living in the United States versus Thailand or Thailand versus Singapore, what type of data would I pull as an economist to make that comparison? We're also going to look at ideas of income inequality because that tells us a lot about a society. We might have some general idea of the average income, but the average income doesn't tell us anything about how wide that income distribution might be. And we want to take a look at poverty. We're going to talk about two different concepts, absolute poverty and relative poverty. When we talk about the size of an economy, we use a measure called gross domestic product, and we abbreviate it GDP. So GDP is gross domestic product. For those of you in the business school, you've seen this before in your principles of economics classes. GDP is the value of all final goods produced within a country's borders in a year. All final goods. Notice I have that in caps. All final goods produced within a country's borders for a period of a year. Now, why final goods? Why not just all goods and services? Why does it have to be just final goods? Well, this is to avoid double counting. I don't want to count the same thing over and over again. So consider a situation where I add up the value of all wheat that has been grown, and then all flour that has been produced, and then I add in all the bread that's been produced and the value of all sandwiches produced. Do you see the problem that we have? We will have counted the same thing over and over and over again, right? The sandwich has bread, and the bread has flour, and the flour is made from wheat. So if I don't want to double count, I would just count it once. Let's count everything at the sandwich level because that reflects the bread, which reflected the flour, which reflected the wheat. So final goods and services. If we pull Thailand's gross domestic product, we see that it is just over 505,000 millions for year 2021. Now that's kind of an awkward way of writing the number, but when we write it that way, it keeps us from having to put all those zeros. Imagine a table full of all these numbers of trillions of dollars. It would just be impossible. So we kind of use a shortcut abbreviation by saying how many millions? Well, this would be a little over 505,000 millions. But if you wanted, you could put all those zeros back in. If we do the same for Thailand, we get a much bigger number. You see that it's 23 and some odd millions. What we're seeing here is a very different sized economy. But here's the thing. We've used this form of gross domestic product using current dollars, basically prices in United States for US, prices in Thailand for Thailand. But this form of GDP doesn't take into account that money goes further in Thailand than in the United States. Well, how do we make it fair? Because if you want to go get a nice hotel room in the United States, it might cost you $150, but you can get that same quality of hotel room in Thailand and it may only be $40. So how do we account for the fact that it's not really a fair comparison because US prices are so much higher than Thailand prices? So what do we do to make that a fair comparison? Well, we have to use another version of gross domestic product. And this is what we call purchasing power parity. PPP, and we call it purchasing power parity because what it's going to do is try to even out the purchasing power and control for the purchasing power of those dollars in the economy. So hopefully you understand why that might be relevant when I can go get a plate of pad thai noodles in Thailand for $2, but that same plate of pad thai noodles in the United States is going to cost me like $13. So it makes it seem like Thailand has a lot less money in its economy, but that money goes so much further. If we convert to purchasing power parity and don't worry about how we convert, just understand that we do convert, all of a sudden, look at Thailand's new number when we look at purchasing power parity. It's more than double what it was before when we just looked at Thailand prices. So all of a sudden, purchasing power parity version of gross domestic product makes the economy look like it has much more money, because what we're doing is saying, how much does this actually buy? Now, for the United States, we get a very similar number, which makes sense. Now the gap between them doesn't look quite as big. I mean, it's still pretty big, am I right? But it doesn't look as big. So let's just make sure you're clear. Why did Thailand's GDP go up when we use the purchasing power parity version? Well, that's because now what we're doing is that we're using US prices of things. So, all right, when we looked at the first set of numbers at the top, that plate of pad thai noodles was $2 in Thailand and $13 in the US. But what if we say, hey, look, let's use US prices. You buy a plate of pad thai noodles for $2 in Thailand, but it's $13 in the US. Instead of multiplying it by $2, let's multiply it by $13. So you kind of get the idea. Just as a reference, when we're in Thailand, you're going to see that a plate of fried rice is $1.50 in Thailand, but you can get it in a Chinese restaurant for probably about $5, $7, depending if you're a fast food type place. And so we need a way to make it a fair comparison so that we can acknowledge that money goes a lot further in Thailand. Well, that's what the purchasing power parity version of gross domestic product is doing. So if I were to ask you why we have a bigger number for Thailand when we look at purchasing power parity, hopefully that now makes sense to you and you could explain it to me. All right, so let's go back to the current dollar version, the first numbers that we were looking at, right? 505,000 million, and for the US, 23 million. Now, if we do the math, we see that the US economy is 46 times as large as Thailand's economy. Well, how did I figure that out? I just took the bigger number for the US and divided it by the smaller number for Thailand, right? So if I take the 23 million divided by 505,000 million, we've got Thailand's economy being much smaller. US is 46 times as large as Thailand. But here's the thing. In the United States, we have 4.6 times more people. So is it really fair to just say, look, our economy is 46 times larger? Maybe we need to account for the fact that our money has to go over a whole lot more people, almost 5 times as many people. So we really have to think about the number of people the money is supporting, and that's an important measure. Without thinking this way, the data could be very misleading, right? All we know is that our economy is bigger, but we're also a bigger country with more people. China's a great example of this, and this is an older example. It doesn't really matter because I'm just using it for illustrative purposes. But in 2011, China had the second largest gross domestic product in the world. It was the second largest economy. So here's our numbers. We were number one. Gross domestic product for us in 2011 is a little over 15 millions. China's number two at a little over 11 million. These economies are not that drastically different in size, am I right? So the question is, does this mean that the standard of living is similar between the United States and China? Well, think about what you know about China. Are they going to have the same standards of living? I mean, their GDPs aren't that different. They're number one and number two. Well, clearly we know it's not. Standard of living in USA is not like standard of living in China. They are very, very different. We know that China is a developing country, whereas the United States is a developed country. And we also know that China has a huge population to support on this income, right? I know you've heard a lot about just how large China's population is and that they've taken kind of draconian methods to try to get their population growth down. So we need to move on to another idea. For the idea of standard of living, if we're trying to say not just the size of the economy, but how does it translate into standard of living, we need to look at an idea called GDP per capita. Now, per capita means per person. So think about what we're doing here. Instead of just looking at total GDP, I want to know how much GDP there is on a per person basis. So this is going to give us a measure of the average income level on a per person basis. So on average, what portion of GDP does each person get? It's a good proxy for average income. So how do I calculate it? Well, I'm going to take gross domestic product, which is the whole number for the entire economy, right? And divide it by the number of people it supports. Divide it by population. So if we take GDP and divide it by population, then this lets us think about how many people the income has to support. And this is very telling. So this is going to be a way of thinking about standard of living, GDP per capita. It's going to allow us to compare also between a small and a large country. I mean, imagine if we were comparing China to Monaco. Monaco is really small. Well, that's not a fair comparison. How would I compare GDP for China, a huge country, to Monaco, a richer but really tiny country? I need some way to do it. Well, GDP per capita allows us to make that comparison. So let's do that. When we convert GDP to GDP per capita basis, we're going to see a huge difference between the United States and China. All of a sudden, the numbers look drastically different. Where GDP looks somewhat similar because it was number 1 and number 2 in rank in 2011, we see something different. So let's do that now. For 2010, 2011, if we divide GDP by the number of people in the population, all of a sudden we get United States with an average of 48,387. So the average person has an income, it's a proxy, it's kind of an estimate of income, of 48,000 and some odd dollars. Remember, this is a number of years ago. But China, look at that, it's number 92 with an average of 8,382. So what's happened? Okay, they were similar sizes in the economy, but China was spreading it across a humongous population and the United States across a smaller population. And so that helps us understand that, look, while the size of the economies are the same, the standards of living are not very similar between the United States and China. So let's do the same thing for Thailand and the United States. All right, so we've got Thailand with a GDP of 505-ish thousand millions. We've got a population of 71.6 million. Do you see why we might keep it millions and millions? Because then I don't have to put all those zeros there. I can divide one by the other. So we take 505,947, the top number, divided by 71.6, and those million part, that crosses out, right? And we get a GDP per capita for Thailand of a little over 7,000, right? $7,066. Remember, this is just an estimate of what the average person would look like, and this is under a certain kind of GDP. Remember, we talked a minute ago that we have different kinds. We have that current dollar one, and then we have that purchasing power parity. This is not purchasing power parity. Now let's do the same thing for the United States. We have GDP of 23-ish millions, and we need to divide it by a population of 331.9 million. So again, I can just take the top number divided by the bottom number, and then that gives me GDP per capita of a little over 70,247. We see that when we're using GDP per capita using the current dollars, not the purchasing power parity, the gap is huge, right? The United States, the average person has, proxying this as a measure of income, an income that is 10 times just about as much as a person in Thailand, who's the average person. The good news is that GDP per capita for Thailand has been on the rise. So if you look at this graph, you see it goes from 1960 to year 2020. And because I'm going over time, I have to use a whole nother version of GDP per capita, and it's not worth getting into all this, but we know we're going to have inflation over time, and I don't really want to capture the inflation, right? If the price of fried rice goes from $5 to $6, well, that's not growth, that's not economic growth, that's inflation, right? So I want to take away that inflation and look at just the growth in our productivity and our production. Well, we see GDP per capita is on the rise. But look at that part that I have circled. What's that little blip right there, guys? In Thailand, we see that decrease. What's going on there? COVID, the pandemic, right? So you understand that this shows that GDP per capita, which is a good estimate of the income per person, the average income per person, has been on the rise. So that's going to translate into standard of living going up, and that is a great thing. Now here is 2021 purchasing power parity version. Again, remember what we do. Instead of the previous number, which was like 7,000, we have to say, okay, look, money goes really far in Thailand, so we have to somehow take into account that that plate of pad thai noodles is only $2 and it's $13 in the US. So what if we took US prices but multiplied them by Thailand's production and output? Now the number goes up, right? So basically we're saying that what you can buy in Thailand is approximately equal to 17,000-ish dollars of what you could buy in the United States. That makes a little bit more sense when we're trying to compare. So purchasing power parity is generally a good thing when we're trying to make a comparison. But now we see Thailand with a GDP per capita purchasing power parity of a little over 17,000. Okay, so that's not so bad. And it's been going up and up and up, and that's good news for Thai citizens. It's important to understand that GDP per capita is useful, but it doesn't tell us everything. We have got to remember that GDP per capita is an average, right? All we did is took all the productivity, the production, the dollar value of the final goods and services, and we divided it by population. That just gives us an average. On average, this is the amount of dollar value of production per person. So we're really just describing the average person in the country. And it's a good proxy, as I said, of average income. But here's the thing, it doesn't tell us how income is distributed amongst citizens. Just knowing something about that average person is good, right? It allows me to say the average person in the United States is probably better off in standard of living than the average Thai person, if we're just caring about, dollars and purchasing power. But it doesn't tell us how income is distributed. We know that Thailand has very wealthy people, for sure, but there's also very poor people. And so GDP per capita doesn't help us know what the distribution of incomes look like. Is it super wide where we have lots of people who are really rich and lots of people who are really poor, or is it a tighter distribution? Again, an average can't tell us that. So let me give you some numerical illustrations to help make this clear. We have a situation here with 5 people in the economy. I'm just simplifying this so we can easily understand this. So we have an economy with 5 people, and trust me when I tell you that the average income here is $27,000. So I have rigged the numbers so that we have an average income of $27,000. If we look at from high to low income, the distribution's not that bad, right? We have a high of 40,000 and a low of 15,000. Now there's a gap, but that gap could be much bigger, right? It could be a much wider distribution. So I'm not trying to say this is unequal, but it's only somewhat unequal. And it's possible with the lowest income being 15,000 that we don't have anyone living in extreme poverty, right? I didn't say this is the United States. It could be a developing country. We have an interesting income distribution here with an average of 27,000, and it's not that unequal. But let's look at this income distribution. So I've changed the numbers, but guys, there's still an average income of 27,000. So I have 2 different income distributions, and they have the same average. But here, do you see that there's much more income inequality? How do I know that? Well, let's look at the minimum and the maximum. Here, the minimum is 8,000. Before it was 15. The maximum is 77,000, but before it was 40. This is a much wider income distribution, and we have more income inequality. We might, in this example, have somebody living in poverty. Again, we don't know, but it's possible that that person at the lowest income is actually living in poverty. And we'll be talking about what we mean by poverty in a few minutes. And that might be especially true if she has kids. Maybe she's a single parent and is raising 3 children. It's very possible that her income being that low might put her officially in poverty. So again, the point that I'm trying to make is knowing the average income, like knowing the GDP per capita, doesn't tell us anything about the distribution. It's useful, but it is also misleading if I don't try to learn more. So as I said, knowing GDP per capita is certainly helpful. I can make comparisons. We can rank, right? We can see who is the richest country per capita in Southeast Asia. That would be Singapore. And then who is the poorest country? That allows us to make comparisons when we look at GDP per capita. But as we just explained, it paints an incomplete picture because the distribution of income does matter for a society. If you're a highly unequal income distribution society, that's going to have certain social implications. Is it more equal? Is it more unequal? We need to know answers like that. We don't want to just stop by looking at GDP per capita. Now, according to the 2023 World Bank report that I was reading, it suggested that Thailand has the most income inequality in Southeast Asia. Okay, well, that's not great. I mean, it's a growing economy and that's good, but it also has large degrees of income inequality. So the average income is rising, standards of living are going up, and that's always a good thing. But countries don't want to have more income inequality. More income inequality likely means more poverty. Let's think about why that would be the case. So think about an income distribution, and now let's make it more unequal by stretching it out. It means there's more people in the upper tail with the high incomes, but there's also more people in the lower tails, more likely, with really low income. That's where your poverty is going to be. And so in Thailand, this is going to be especially true in rural areas. And you're going to see some very clear differences in standard of living as we drive around, and differences that are going to be really dramatic when we compare, for example, the capital of Bangkok to really rural areas that we'll see. Fortunately, poverty is on the decline in Thailand. That's always a goal. Try to reduce your population that is impoverished. So let's look at this data because this is truly incredible. Now here, it's measuring poverty as living on less than $5.50 a day. And I would imagine over time they're adjusting that $5.50 for inflation. But let's look at the left side of the graph. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, look what you're seeing. You're seeing poverty rates that are over 50%. I mean, can you imagine having 50% of your population living under what you would consider a poverty line, determining who's impoverished and who is not? But we see dramatic decline, and that is great news. So let's talk about different ways of looking at poverty, absolute versus relative poverty. Let's start with the idea of absolute poverty. When we talk about absolute poverty, we're talking about lacking of one or more basic needs over a period that's long enough that it endangers one's life or can cause harm. So we're lacking basic needs, and it happens for a long enough period where your health is going to be at risk. It can risk your life. It can cause you harm. So this could be vital and biological needs. What might be some vital and biological needs? Well, things like food, water, clothing, the things that we need to keep ourselves safe and healthy. Housing, basic housing. It doesn't necessarily have to be fancy housing, but you need to have probably a decent roof over your head. And if you're living in a really cold climate, then you need to have some way to protect yourself from the elements. And there needs to be some minimum level of sanitation. You can imagine that those people in the United States that still live without indoor plumbing, and that does exist, well, we would say that that would be lacking a basic need that, if you endured that long enough, could keep you from being as healthy. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a beautiful modern bathroom. Maybe you even do have an outhouse, but there has to be some minimum level of sanitation that we find acceptable. So basically what I'm saying is that we're comparing the situation to an absolute standard. We have in our mind what people need to be happy and healthy and safe, and if you don't meet that standard, then you would be impoverished. So an income related example would be what we just saw, living on less than $5.50 a day. If that's your measure of poverty, that we think you need $5.50 a day to meet your basic needs so that you can address your vital and biological needs. If you are below that, then you are in absolute poverty. You do not meet this standard. We could also see being below a threshold, and this would be like the United States' poverty line. I'm going to show that to you, not because I expect you to learn it, but I want you to understand how we measure it. Living on less than $5.50 a day is the poverty line in Thailand, and if you fall under that, then you're in poverty in the absolute sense. And we do have similar lines in the United States based on annual income. We use this poverty line to determine things like eligibility for social services. Are you eligible for food benefits like EBT? Do you get some kind of housing assistance? Are you eligible for Medicaid, which is healthcare for people who are low income? This is our poverty line for the United States in 2023. And again, we don't need to go through all of this, but this is what we mean. You're not meeting an absolute standard. This is what we think a person needs in a certain situation to be able to meet their basic needs. So if you're just one individual, let's look at the 2023 numbers on the right. We say you need $14,580 to meet your basic needs. If you are below that, you are in poverty. But look what happens for a family of four. $30,000. Obviously, we have to adjust it. You got more mouths to feed. You need a little bit bigger house or apartment. So this is what we mean by absolute poverty. And it's easy to measure because we can simply say, do you fall above it? Do you fall below it? If you fall below it, you are by definition in poverty. What is relative poverty? This is a little bit harder concept to think about. This is a condition in which people lack the minimum amount of income needed in order to maintain the average standard of living in the society in which they live. So think about what we're doing. In this case, instead of comparing it to some dollar amount like the poverty line I just showed you for the United States, we're saying, look, do you have the amount of income needed to be at our average standard of living in society in the United States or in Thailand, wherever you might live? So it's important to understand that this is defined in terms of the society in which an individual lives. And it's going to be different for different countries. So it differs between different countries because as the wealth of society increases, our social standards change, right? The average standard of living in the United States is not the same as the average standard of living in Thailand. This is where we begin to have a different opinion about the resources necessary for proper conditions of living if our benchmark is the average standard of living in society. Because as you're going to see, the average person in Thailand does have a very different standard of living and lifestyle than does the average person in the United States. But some pictures can help us really get our brain around these ideas. These kids live in absolute poverty in the Dominican Republic. This is from a former alternative spring break that I used to lead in the Dominican Republic. And here we are in these Haitian communities in Dominican Republic. These are people that are working in sugarcane fields and being paid absolutely awful. Some of them are kind of enslaved labor. Long story, but look at what we're seeing here in these pictures. There are days that these kids aren't going to eat. Their houses are barely even houses. They have dirt floors. They're made of scrap materials, whatever they can find. When it rains, these houses are going to flood. It is going to be really unsanitary in these houses. And for some communities, they don't have access to running water. Some communities we visited had to walk for 2 hours to get clean water. So this is definitely substandard. These families own very little. There's no furniture, toys, little clothing. I saw little old ladies like your grandmother's age sleeping on cardboard on the floor in these communities. So we all agree this is an example of absolute poverty. There is not going to be any question there. They are below whatever poverty line exists for the Dominican Republic. Here's another area that we stayed in the Dominican Republic. This could be an example of relative poverty. The house has a roof and a cement floor, but it doesn't have any indoor plumbing. We had to go outside to use the outhouse, and when it was time to take a shower, we had a bucket of water and we just used a little sponge and cleaned ourselves. The toilet, as I said, is in the backyard. The kitchen's also in the backyard behind the house. It's very primitive. This house gets electricity, but only part of the time. The electricity rotates around the community. So, is this relative poverty? Well, it depends on what country you're comparing to. Now, I kind of already told you this was Dominican Republic, but what if I didn't tell you it was the Dominican Republic? Would you be able to tell me if this is relative poverty or not? You wouldn't. You need to know what country, because relative poverty is judged against the average standard of living. So in rural Dominican Republic, this is not poverty. This is a cute house. It's well maintained. It's got a nice floor. It has furniture. It had a refrigerator. The family has its basic needs met, and it probably is on par with the average standard of living in Dominican Republic, or at least in these rural areas. In the United States, though, it could be different, right? Maybe our answer's different, because this might not be the average standard of living. Lack of indoor plumbing, lack of modern sanitation, that might put us below acceptable standards, and it might put us below average standard of living in the United States. The fact that they don't have full-time electricity might also put them below the average standard of living for the United States. Of course, it would be hard to live in some climates without the ability to cool and heat your house. So imagine climates where the temperature drops far below zero. And imagine if you were living in sweltering South Texas, where it gets super hot and humid, but you don't have any air conditioning half the time because you only have electricity part of the time. You get the idea. So here's a picture from Bangkok. Let's take a look at this for a second. And we're going to see some lower incomes in Bangkok, but this may or may not be it. Don't be so quick to deem this as poverty. And I point this out because one year my students, when we were on the SkyTrain, said, oh my gosh, those people are living in poverty. Well, take a look at this. Is this poverty for Thailand? Well, I think we can all agree this is not absolute poverty. I mean, they have a decent structure. It probably has the amenities that they need. Again, it's simple, but I'm not sure I would call this absolute poverty for Thailand. And it may not be relative poverty either, because again, we have to judge it against the average standard of living in Thailand. So again, we need to think about Thai standards. We can't impose our own standard of living when we're trying to think about issues related to poverty, both absolute and relative. Their standards are clearly very different from ours. So we have to go kind of with an open mind and think about that they have a different way of life. Their expectations are different. Somebody who has a really good income may not live in a huge 5,000 square foot house in Thailand. But what about this? So take a good look at this picture here and at what you're seeing. Now, what you're seeing are squatters. What I mean by that is these are people who are building these haphazard structures in whatever manner they can, and this is land that is not privately owned. So this isn't their land. In fact, if you look close enough, you kind of see that what they're doing is building on the riverbanks, right? And they're actually kind of in the water. But look at that pretty closely. Do these even look structurally sound? I'm guessing no. You can see that they're kind of cockeyed. The roof doesn't look super stable, and they're standing in the water. This is likely absolute poverty, and I can definitely show you some of this when we're in Bangkok. We're probably going to see some as we go along the river, unless the government has done something to clear all of this out. But I've seen it for many, many years. We also know that the refugee problem adds to the concerns about poverty. There are thousands of refugees that are crossing into Thailand. It's estimated in early 2022 that there was something like 17,000 people from Myanmar alone. And of course, they're coming and they're living along the border in very, very simple conditions. Why are they leaving Myanmar? Well, escaping violence and oppression. So it's probably a reasonable risk to take, especially if you have kids and you want them to be safe. There's been problems with ethnic cleansing for ethnic minorities. And so there are over 90,000 refugees that live along the camps that have been built on the Thai borders. And this adds to the poverty problem. For example, this is Mae La Refugee Camp. And if you take a look at it, I mean, these are pretty simple structures. They may not have their basic amenities that you would have if you lived in Bangkok. We'd have to know more. This might not be absolute poverty, but I'm guessing if we were right there on the ground, we'd get a sense that these are just thatched huts. They don't own very much. I'm guessing that there may be some electricity, but it probably doesn't run to the houses. What about sanitation? What are they doing? Can they keep themselves safe and healthy and clean? Do they have access to water? It's not obvious that they do, so where are they going to get those things? So we'd have to know more, but clearly there's going to be concerns about all the refugees coming and the problem that creates for increasing poverty, increasing inequality, and handling these populations. So guys, let's wrap up. We've started to look at some key economic statistics. We looked at gross domestic product and gross domestic product per capita. It's very important that you understand the difference. It's important that you understand which one allows us to compare standards of living. So make sure you know the answer to that question. If I wanted to compare standard of living between two countries, would I look at GDP or GDP per capita? It's also important that you understand what these numbers do and do not tell us. And when you're in Thailand, evaluate what you are seeing. It's going to be really interesting as we do. Think about absolute and relative poverty as we travel around. See if you can identify examples of both. So guys, let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a fantastic day.